Hello and good afternoon and salutations to all. You are tuned into Poets in the City, a not-for-profit arts charity who help people to place their stories and tell their stories. Today, we're going to be talking to some amazing poet activists as part of Poets in the City. What is digital event series? We're going to be unpicking contemporary buzzwords such as resilience and resistance, protest, political activism through poetry readings and discussions. We'll be hearing from two amazing poets who I love so much. They're out there with their writing, they're doing all kinds of amazing things, contributing to making multiple changes within society, using their gift of the written word and live performance. But before we do all of that, we're going to kick off with me. I will introduce the poets later on, but they're going to kick off with me reading some of my own poetry. So I'm going to be reading from Another Crossing, which is my collection, which was published in 2014 by People Tree Press. And I was wondering about being an activist. I'm a poet, I'm a writer. I like to write about things that are out there. A lot of my work is about decolonizing the archives. I think that poetry is a leading force in making changes. It's an act of resilience. And so I'm hoping that with my poetry, I can inspire so many people. This poem that I'm going to read is dated in the 1980s when I was looking at the whole thing of Black culture, which is interesting today because as an activist, I've been part of championing and supporting the BAME over. The fact that BAME is over, thank God, and that we can label ourselves and define ourselves as individuals. So this poem is dedicated to the 1980s. It's called Black is Black. Black is black, in we heartbeat of chants, in we music, mixing soul and gospel, beating bass and drum. You can't hold us down, we players of instruments, we makers of music, we singers, we dancers. It's just how we do it. From front room parties to basement raves, all dayers and all nighters, rare reggae grooves and James Brown's funk rhythms, yeah, that came right back in the break beats, the loops, the mixing down of house and hip hop and best foot moves, tearing up the warehouse parties. We locked and popped and did the wop. Cork's the Wad Club, the Gallery and Harvey's Wine Bar. We rocked in Doc Martin boots. Levi 501s. We balanced flat caps over curly perm and extension plaits. We moved against Thatcher's times. We flipped the script to come again in UK street riots. We were talking blues, talking blues. They say your feet is just too big for your shoes. From the underground, DJs called up all the elements, sound system dance, Genesis FM, funky dread, soul to soul with a thumping bass, while Black and British, voice of an angel, Karen Wheeler, smoothed the heat, kept us moving, back to life, back to reality. We African, we African Caribbean, we black and British. It's just how we do it. It's however we want it to be. We ride upon the rhythm, wheel it back pan diversion, sound system style, and into the 90s, we said there was nothing like this. Sip a glass of cold champagne wine, because there is nothing like this. So that is my first poem. I'm going to read a second poem. And this poem is dedicated to the youth. And I call them the MC Revolution. Get up, stand up. Get up, stand up. There's a revolution. The youth, them a 16-bar MC. Freestyle lyrical architect chanters. Dre beats wired through phones. Them a jam tune on a street corner. Them a waddle and a bounce in a cipher. Saggy style night kicks philosophers. Shh. Listen to the ancient griot's heartbeat, chatting the woes of this generation. 1,000 unanswered questions, rhymed into stanzas, ripping on the microphone, spitting in a style, in a bass line, in banter. See them assume a rude boy stance, with the same slang in them wordsmith mouth. Januars, wagwan, blood, easy my youth. Rhythms still flow like water to tell you their dreams. The DJ's the president of the scratch and mixtape sampler. The girl them and the man them hold tight in the laters, in the early hours. But do they know where the hardcore bassline rhythms come from? Do they know the hard time style where cold ground was my bed last night and rock was my pillow too? Does David Olawale or Olive Morris or the Mangrove Nine or the new Crossfire ring any bells today? Does Jano's blood mean the same as God knows everything? I hear the youth man chatting and I wonder about them struggle, about absent fathers and mothers who have less time to keep things ship shape. Does them granny's cooking pot still sweet them? Is it more than the local takeaway? Is the stories of who they are still ring bells of the past? Does their beauty still shine where their eyes swell regular at gravesides? There's another death in a zone, a post-Cold War, where if you reach 21, it's a blessing. I wonder why I'm asking all these questions. Is it because I'm just getting old? So that is from my collection, Another Crossing. Right, as I mentioned, we have two amazing poets that I'd like to introduce. And the first poet in our lineup is the amazing Joelle Taylor. And out there in the YouTube world, I want you to put your hands together while I introduce the amazing Joelle Taylor. She's a poet, author, and educator, the founder of Slambassador, the UK National Poetry Slam Championship. She's widely anthologized, the author of 3 poetry collections. Her new poetry collections, Kuntu, will be published by Saki Books in June 2021. I want you to give a whole shout out in your own spaces while we welcome the amazing Joelle Taylor, who's going to read for us and share some of her amazing poetry. Are you there with us, the lovely Joelle?
I am there. I'm right here, Khadijah. Okay, thank
Lovely.
you so much for that amazing introduction. And I loved your poems, particularly the first one, going back to the 80s and having that kind of connection. It's a time that I was in as well. So I'm going to read a 5-minute section of the kind of the poem Conto. This was commissioned by Apples and Snakes a couple of years ago for their massive rallying cry happening. And I was commissioned to write a 15-minute piece around the theme of protest. And so I sat down and this is what came out. It's really the story of it's kind of part memoir, part imagined, the story of me being a butch lesbian and growing up. Yeah, imagine it's set in a boxing ring with roped off in barbed wire. Some girls fall from sunlit skies straight down into flat pack floral dresses, grab their smiles from a hook behind the door, rescue their faces from riptides of mirrors. Some girls are always falling. Round 1. You fall and miss your body entirely. Land somewhere in enemy territory, behind the lines. Your body, a foreign country you cannot get a visa for. Your skin, a parachute caught in tree branches. You awaken in no man's land. Gunfire from over the horizon, and women are crucified on hashtags across the dark hills. Your trench is crowded with dead women wearing faces that try to escape them and the clothes of someone you once knew. There are landmines buried deep beneath your skin and no one understands them. In between the battleground and the bedroom is this sticky, quiet, this no man's land. And this is where you live. Men explode when you least expect it. You will spend a lifetime searching for your body. Round 2. You don't wear makeup to prove you have not made anything up. This is your face. Your father's friends gave it to you one Christmas Eve, 1973. You unwrapped it beneath a decorated tree from which the rest of your family hung. They sipped cocktails as you slowly disappeared, swaying gently to that harbinger of party, the wail of celebration. You cut your first suit from the thick silence when you enter a room. Round 3. In sleep, my body is a haunted house. There are footsteps along fallopian corridors. The corridor is a rope strung across a mouth. I have been woken by blurred voices without bodies, quiet arguments in my basement. Once, I was possessed by a girl who looked the same as me, who self-murdered on a Sunday afternoon as her parents were downstairs hardwiring their hangovers and Christmas tunes played on nooses. My heart is a church bell, but nobody visits. And God is a man with his hands in his pockets, watching. Round 4. Oh, you bayonet boys, you truncheon rub. My face doesn't fit my face, but your fist does. Years from now, no one will remember how we fought, how each bruised knuckle was a white boy's head bent in prayer. No one will remember the love, how alike it is to rage, how screams made corporeal are rainbows, or how rainbows became corporate logos, or how we carved our epitaphs onto a stone wall. No one will remember unpicking acronyms by candlelight, so I'll be in the back bar of heaven. Cass will be getting a rounding and releasing that laugh, wild birds escaping her mouth, and none of this will matter. I'll be riding the ghost roads with Avi, bareback, knee clench on a Harley. I'll be stretching the skins with Sam Sylvan. How did we ever get so old, so silver-backed? I'll be scuffing the city with Doodzilly. Men will stare like open shaft mines. I'll be walking the white lines with Tony. Tight mouth, antelope heart. Can't remember the names of all my dead friends, but they're here now. Our grief, a leather jacket, our laughter, static, as we fade to a sepia, the colour of blood mixed to water, disappearing down a plug hole, much like the meeting of our legs. Remember this, my whole life is a protest. Okay, thank you. Khadijah.
Thank you. I'm just clicking, you know, I'm just clicking, clicking, and I'm just saying to our viewers, click. Even though we can't hear them, we can just send that energy down the internet line or whatever you call it. The digital line. So we're clicking for you, Joelle. Thank you so much. That's amazing. I love your performances all the time. They're so expressive. And we're going to come back to you and going to be asking you some questions. So thanks very much. We're going to move on, and we're going to introduce another amazing poet, and her name is Amina. So let's get ready for Amina. So Amina, she's in the house with us, and I just want to introduce her. Amina Atik is a Yemeni Scouse writer, performance artist, and activist. Atiq's work explores the conflict of her dual identity of her heartland, Yemen, and the homeland of Liverpool. So we just want to give her a shout out and welcome her to this platform. Are you ready? Are you with us, Amina?
Yeah, I am here. Hi, guys. Joelle, I'm literally speechless. We actually met about 4 years ago with Writing on the Wall, and I remember watching you perform. I was still quite young at the time, still emerging into the poetry scene, and I remember thinking, oh, I want to perform like that. So I'm just an honour to be amongst both of you as well, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. So I am Scouse, so we do speak for the whole of England. So I'm just going to crack on with it. So I'm going to start off with a piece called Belong, and I think it's only right that I perform this today. In terms of my vision of who I am first, who do I see myself in this world, but it's also to accept that is the world ready for us. So Belong. We swerved between checkpoints. An armed young man watched from a distance. An elderly man squatting in a dark corner stared. A group of veiled women on the balcony giggled. And I stuck my national flag out of the car window. Reds, whites, blacks, faded. And the colour in my skin brushed against the plain window, and I was there. And I was there in a strange land, and I was there greeted. Soon we became friends, and soon we became best friends. Too soon we betrayed our roots. My olive backcombed hair, I hated the smell. Too thick to carry, too different. It reminded me too much of the girls back home. I chopped it all off. And I was there in glass windows and brick walls, begging on the streets for a penny for a guy watching the firework display lights up your new city. And eat a halal Christmas dinner and sprinkle grandma's spices, a taste we've been trying to recreate even if we tried. And then soon my Scouse accent lingered on my tongue, and I wanted to feel wanted like that. And I made sure that I did. But I slept with my mother's voice in my ear. Never, never forget where you came from. But I said in my broken Arabic, Mama, Heather huwa biladi. This is the home I need. And then a little ginger boy shouts from the other side, hey, where do you come from? And I, picking at my scars, and I picking at my skin, scarred with mosquito bites to remind me what is marked should never be forgotten. And in my perfect broken English, scouse, I come from here. I come from here. He looks down at his hands, but you look different. I stuck my tongue out. You want to come out and play? He nodded and smiled. We played piggy in the middle with his friends, and by sunset, it was my least favourite game because I couldn't sleep that night. Because there were sirens on my TV and he looked like my uncle, bearded, Arab, brown eyes, olive skin, terrorist. We see I kept God in a small box and I learned how to cry. And if home asks for my return, I will return. And I'll meet her between the valley and the mountains, and you'll find me drinking water from her palms. But I yearn to taste my mother's bread and knock at my friend's house to tell her, maybe I do not belong here. Thank you. And then I'm just going to do a really short one. And this is probably the activism in me. Growing up in high school, secondary school, and facing Islamophobia, racism, words that we didn't even know exist. Writing this poem 7 years later, you acknowledge that this is where the activism started, which was running down double-decker buses. So my mother's anthem in a foreign place. Girls like us go to war every day. We placed on our armors, tucked in our school shirts, lifted our skirt, chasing those white boys down double-decker buses. You racist prick, I shouted, running down Queen's Drive as he chased me with a knife. Because girls like us were forced to learn English quicker, to save us from a stab wound in our backs. We wore expensive running shoes, hanging our keys from our necks, to let them know that we are coming. Because girls like us settled in a foreign place, but we buried our mother's tongue in our back gardens to find the root have outgrown even deeper. And we grew balls with pink bows, and we passed borders with our homes, dancing two-step melody around the immigration officer. I flutter my tongue, recite my tribal name, explaining to him why I still smell like my grandma's spices and lime. Because girls like us are told to throw our veils in the river, because no letterbox delivers here. But you wait for Trump to blow his trumpet and kiss the face of Boris Johnson, but you hide behind your curtains, sucking on your mother's olives. But you keep on dancing. You keep on dancing. Thank you. Well, thanks, guys.
Amina, click, 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 and lots of claps. That is absolutely amazing. Thank you for sharing your poetry. We're going to move on and just really have you both in the space, and let's have a discussion around activism. And so I'm going to ask you both to unmute yourself. That's okay? All right. All right. So I do have a few questions that I'd like to ask you both around activism and your work as writers. So, you know, one of the first questions, and either one of you can answer. So I'm really interested in your views on how you feel as a performer, as a poet, as a writer, how your work can act as a catalyst of resistance and change.
Shall I start?
Yeah.
It's gonna go. I'm so rude. Amina, that was so good. That was incredible. Cinematic. Thank you for that. Well, just listening to the poetry here, right? Here's how it happens. You create these kind of tiny cinemas that people fall in. And when you fall in a poem and you're part of that narrative, you have an empathy and you start to understand the people, not just like the person who's delivering the poem, but the characters within the piece itself. I think all poetry is political because you make a choice, a political choice about what you write about. And I think the spoken word community in particular, and spoken word poetry, has the ability to gather audiences together, to interrogate ideas, to make connections, to support each other, particularly people from, you know, more marginalized and working class backgrounds. So that's it. You change by writing. You just literally get up and you write. And that moment is quantum physics. In that moment of writing, something starts to change.
I love that, that quantum physics of moment of change. And what are your views, Amina, on on that same
Yeah, sorry, my dyslexic mind just went blank. Can you tell me the question again?
No, really what I'm asking is that how you see yourself as a writer, a performer. How does your work act as a catalyst for change? What changes do you feel that you're making?
Okay, well, how I see myself, I used to see myself as like, it's a responsibility, but I realize I'm carrying not just my Muslim faith, I'm also going against anti-fascism groups. I'm also a young woman. I'm also, a woman of color. I wear the hijab, and I thought that is a lot to take on. I can't think that I'm responsible, and I need to talk to everybody. And I thought, you know what, it needs to begin from within, from myself. And I believe poetry is not just writing and putting things on a page. It's about you being a poet, your way of how you view the world, how you observe, how you treat others. It's a way of life. And I can tell from far who's a poet. It's the way, the wisdom, the way that, and I'm not trying to compliment myself here. It's also, you've got to work hard for it. You've got to master yourself, and you train yourself. And writing saved me, poetry saved me.
Yeah.
And you can, that's quite ambiguous, but it did save me from a lot of things.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's that massive transformative effect, isn't it? So that it goes beyond like just what we do as writers, but like the workshops, for example.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's interesting in terms of saying writing has saved you. And I think a lot of writers, whether they're poets or novelists, playwrights, they feel that writing is a saving grace as part of their well-being. And I'm really interested in those acts of conscious and unconscious, acts of resilience, how text can challenge society within change. And when I think about the writer and activist Ken Saro-Wiwa, who came from Nigeria and who was an activist, and he campaigned against Shell and the oil spills in the Niger Delta and lost his life based around those issues as a campaigner, as an activist. But also people like Nawala Sadawi, an Egyptian writer who writes a lot within the Arab society about women and change and well-being. I mean, where do you both see yourself within your writing as an influence, as a force within community activism and artistic change?
I mean, I think it's central. I think, I mean, even so with Ambassadors, that was a really clear example of trying to use poetry and spoken word to enact change, a transformative effect in young people's lives. And from that kind of spread out to the whole community. But it goes for literally everything that I try to do. Do you know what I mean? And that's what I meant about the sort of the workshopy thing, is because say you're researching a book, the first thing I do is figure out what I'm researching, then who I can take this information to, who else can learn from this, who can learn from my journey. So with Songs My Enemy Taught Me the book, I worked with these 18 different groups of marginalized women's communities, teaching them the skills to be able to tell their own stories. Do you know what I mean? So I think that's where the resilience comes in. It's you create this community around you, or you're part of, I don't know exactly. I'm now thinking of amoebas, like different communities kind of joining together to make a bigger thing. I don't know, what do you think, Amina?
It's a journey and it's a process for every individual writer. Some people write for themselves, some people write for an audience. But I said to myself 2 years ago, I said, I'm in it now. And if I'm in it, I need to go all the way. And what that means is I need to see myself as someone who's going to bring revolution. And when I say revolution, I'm not saying bringing revolution to the streets, but bringing change. And I mean impactful change. And I had to say that to myself to believe it. Because if you and that, like I said, every individual writer will have a different type of journey. We can stop anywhere we want. And this is the most amazing thing about being a poet. You write, you're in control of your narrative. And you're also in control of that journey. So take it in, enjoy it, challenge it, inspire, and and it's the most beautiful, breathtaking journeys I've ever taken, amongst any other journeys that I've had. But this is one of the things that I am quite I can't separate Amina from her poetry, and I can't separate poetry from Amina, and I've accepted that, and I want to go all the way, and hopefully make an impact, whether it's from within myself and my community, and if the world, then why not? Bring it on.
Should be dealing with the world, and which is quite interesting when we think about activism and change and campaigns. And most likely when we talk about being activists, people think that maybe we're campaigners in the street marching, and there's nothing wrong with that because there's a place for that. But also there is an interesting place within writing that can be part and parcel of making change. And where do you see yourselves as I'm thinking about activism within looking at gender and equality, the Me Too hashtags, the Black Lives Matter, bodies, bodies part of a protest of change within the writing world. I mean, where do you find yourselves as writers and activists within that?
Well, so like Songs My Enemy Taught Me, plug, is all like, it's all about highlighting and elevating women's stories, and women's stories that aren't often told, but as from a very particular standpoint. It's a white working class woman sitting in a chair in the East End of London on one day, and then it just kind of looks around the world 360 degrees. So that's kind of one really important part of it, that, you know, so I didn't write it for hashtag Me Too. It came out before then, but it kind of obviously involves a lot of those stories that were being told at that time. But I think it's more about how you respond. So I write about what happens, and I started writing about my sexual abuse and talking about it, which, Khadijah, you can understand I never really wanted to talk about when I was working with young people, because you want the narrative to be about them, not yourself, you know. But so from that, it made me decide. I've become the editor of Outspoken Press and taking over for Anthony Axaguru for a year. And it made me decide I only want to publish women only. Back in the old days, you know, we had a lot of women only presses, and there is a very strong reason for this. It's a way of trying to explore the different way women writers work together as a kind of community, as well as being very strong solo writers and activists, all of them as well. You know, so I think that's one of the things you can do is if you get a bit of privilege or space, you try to open it up so that those people, you know, more people can come through.
Yeah. Amina, what's your thoughts?
I mean, I can't remember the day I started calling out racism, but it was a very young age. And like I said, I didn't even know they were racist slurs. I just knew it felt wrong. And, you know, and so, I mean, you know, where do I see myself in it? I mean, I always say, you know, it's not about being on the front line of everything. It's about being part of the movement. And I tell this to people who were, you know, who were like, oh, I don't want to be an activist. But it's like, why is there so much fear in being active? Active does not mean being on the front line and leading everything. It's about supporting those who are at the front. It's about supporting those who are at the back but need a bit of a push. And that's what a movement should look like. It's about doing it together.
Yeah.
And definitely with like my work, I speak to a particular audience. And I think that's the starting point of asking yourself as a writer, who are you speaking to in your work? And that is quite vital. And in terms of like women's rights and stuff, in terms of my activism with women, I remember something called male war poets while doing my GCSE, and I was always baffled. And I'm just thankfully, like, me, you know, I've got my dad's little attitude, because I kept saying, where's the women?
Yeah.
And, you know, Miss will just say, oh, it's just male war poets. And I'm like, yeah, but where's the women? You know, you tell me so much about men in war, men who died in the trenches, men who survived. Where are the women amongst these men? They do exist. And that has pushed me to now focus on Yemeni women in war. And the fact that when you look at women in war, They're the ones who transform completely. They're the ones holding the country together. They're the ones who are transforming their roles, their gender roles, to participate, to keep the economy going. But you don't hear about them. You don't hear about the fact that they are widows and now they have to look to survive. You don't look at the fact that they've got their own social enterprises and doing their own businesses because they will not depend on anyone else. And this is the thing, we need to start highlighting women's voices in poetry a lot more, especially those who are in countries who don't have the privilege of publishing.
Yeah, 100%. You know, and I think it's our responsibility as more established poets to I call it passing back the mic. That's what we used to call it. The microphone doesn't belong to you, so you look for someone else to assist. I think it really needs to be core to all of our practices, this idea, because otherwise it's always going to be the same. It's going to be the same people who win the same competitions and awards, you know, who get the same sort of high profile shots. But yeah,
and that's interesting that you should say that, passing the mic and removing that thing that's in there about it being the same people, and that applies to the issue of women around globally, that we should focus on them in different ways, is the best way we can. I'm really interested in Amina, you being a young poet, and also just knowing the work of you, Joelle, with the SLAM Ambassadors, working with young people. So what does the future look like in terms of your own writing and passing the mic through activism? You know, what does that look like? Especially you, Amina, when you're talking about Yemeni women, and how do you begin to profile their voices, and how do we profile the next generation of activists and thinkers? How do we shift that movement?
Definitely. I don't know if you can believe it or not, but I'm quite a shy person. I've only learned to be quite confident. So this is all an act. But I am quite shy. I've never really wanted to be in the limelight, you know, pictures, marketing, and and I've always done poetry for the sense of, I want to do something that I'm passionate about. And I know there are young people out there who are passionate about something, and I want to show them that I followed that passion, and to show them where it's got me. So it's more about teaching myself so I can teach others. And now that I facilitate, and this is the amazing thing about a poet, you create work and then everyone wants your wisdom. So they book you in for the workshop. And when I see young people, especially from a community like the Arab community or marginalized groups in our society, and I see them, I remember seeing myself 6 years ago with that voice and that passion. And I think, yes, and that is all I ever want. Like, if I see the future is, I want to, get past the mic to those young people who are now creating work, who are hopefully going to take, our places, and they have a right to do so. And we're going to watch from the sidelines as proud little mothers and fathers. And and that is one way. Teach myself so I can teach others.
Yeah, perfect. What she said, absolutely perfect. And even more specifically, I think for me, it's things like doing the outspoken press, highlighting women's voices, but then thinking about what workshops are useful. So in SLAM Ambassadors, it was all about kids being really disengaged with the education system, with literacy, and then somebody leaping into the room and going and being an amazing rapper or a poet or whatever. So your workshops are always in the same level. That means my writing never really got beyond that level. It's all aimed at 14-year-old boys who didn't want to be in the room. So that creates a whole style, Now I think where we have to go is, like, we've got them interested now. That's not enough, because you get women submitting manuscripts for publication, but because they don't have the tutoring around page poetry necessarily they're not getting in, they're not getting a look in. So, like, it becomes the same Oxford University graduates or the same people who went through university. So I think workshops that we focus on different groups of young people, like, if you want to get into publishing, this is how we're going to do it. This is how you're going to develop. And, groups like Leeds Young Authors do amazing work around that. It's the group that Khadijah founded and still runs, don't you?
Partly. I've been trying to escape it.
Right. It takes a long time. 18 years I was doing it.
Not 18 years, and I'm 17 years. It's like it sticks on you, doesn't it? And the compassion that you have.
I still miss it. I still miss, like when Amina was talking about that spark. It's an energy. And that's what activism is, you know. And it's at its core moment. It is a moment of energy and exchange and a connection where a group of people realize they can affect change together in really small ways.
Yeah, and what I'd like to do for our listeners now on YouTube, I'd like to open it out for Q&A. So I want to give them the opportunity to send through some questions. So, you know, we're going to conclude with this part of the discussion and open it up to our listeners. So we'll wait for some questions to come through. And while we're waiting for that, let's just continue that fact of remembering that this is our part of Poet in the City. And part of this is about activism and change and looking at the future. So one of the things was, where do we see ourselves now, you know, now and in the future? And it's interesting that you said what we're both saying, Joelle, about missing those young people, missing being part of that scene. And it never goes away, does it? You always feel committed to going back and working with those young voices to develop those platforms. I mean, how important is that to you in terms of the future and change?
Yeah, I think it's vital. I think it's a really simple ethic. Maybe it's that giving back, isn't it, ethic? So when I was at the height of doing stuff, I was maybe doing 5 days in different schools around the country and then also performing at night. And I did that for like a long time, a very long time, over a decade. So it gets to a point where you're like, oh my God, I would really like to walk into a room and not have to try and persuade people that poetry's okay, you know? Yeah. But actually having a break from it and going back, you get that impact in your chest, the energy. So it doesn't, if, you know, they give so much, you know, and it's a cliche to say that kids teach us a lot, but they give you as much as you're giving them. It's this equal kind of exchange that goes on. And it's absolutely essential. If we want to save UK culture, we have to be in the schools. We have to get the young people, including everybody who hates poetry. I'm coming for you, you know, because it's actually everything you do is around art and culture.
It really is, isn't it? And young people will say, as we all know, the three of us, that they don't like poetry because of the way it's been taught and the way that they're experiencing that written word on the page. But once artists like ourselves, poets and activists, come into that space, there's something that shifts. And I wonder what's important about that shift in helping people to embrace poetry in a different way. How important to you?
Sorry, I'm literally jumping on my seat because I had this conversation last week saying what's interesting with poetry when it's taught, especially when I remember doing my GCSEs, it's like people that no longer exist. They are far, far away from you, but they are so, so important. And that's how I felt. Like I was like, Simon Armitage, like, you know, he was one of my favourite poets in GCSE. And when I met him in Hull, I was like, you exist. You know, like, you know, because we were so taught in school that this is sacred. You will never meet them. So when young people meet the poets who write work, it's like, you know, I wish when I was younger, as a poet came in, because I love poetry in GCSE, to meet a poet who writes their work and perform their work. And I see some young people, not just to me, but even my peers, when I facilitate with a co-writer, a co-facilitator, I see the young people, like they're so inspired. They don't even know who you are. And what's amazing is with poetry and young people is that, you're right, Khadijah, like it's the way it's taught. And I literally tell them, forget all your red markers and your red pens, what your teachers are giving you to cross out your wrong words out. We don't do that. We call it editing.
Drafting. You could do 10 or 15 redrafts. I've actually got a couple of questions that's come in from our viewers. So thank you very much. So one of the questions is, How do you feel about the word activists being used in a negative context by politicians, media, by politicians and media, referring to human rights lawyers as activist lawyers? Do we get that? So how do we feel about that word, activist, being used in a negative term? And let's talk about the politics of that and the politicians and the media.
Mm. Well, I mean, it's what they're going to do, isn't it? It's really standard. How do I feel about it? I think I'm glad they do it, because it makes it really clear who the good people are and who the bad people are. What is so wrong about a word like activist? I mean, you can't really, this is what's making me laugh about Antifa, you know, like the Antifa, ban them. And it's like, it's not an organization. It's an idea. Yeah. It's, so activism is an idea. To be called an activist poet doesn't mean you have to kind of go out and be doing your poetry on the front line of picket lines or anything. It just means you're actively engaging with the politics of the world in this moment, and that active engagement in the writing changes things. You know, I think when anybody wants to become a politician or to enter that field, I think it tells you everything you need to know about them, really. Frankly, I want people on a grassroots community level affecting real change.
Yeah. Can I add on to that, Khadijah, if you don't mind? That came just to refer, obviously they're afraid because activists are right and they're wrong. Well, it's not really about being right or wrong, it's just about being right to make change, and people are threatened by that. Same with art. You know, art starts a revolution. If you've got a painting on the wall, people will stop and stare, and it'll make people think, and they do not want us to think. But referring to the question, I think that was to do with the was releasing a video, and they actually labelled the lawyers as activist lawyers, and that was to do with those who were being deported. And I've just been campaigning with some Yemeni activists in the UK for those who have been detained in Brookhouse Detention Centre. And actually today, I think 12 Yemeni asylum seekers got deported, if I'm correct. This information always comes quite later on. But and we got quite angry. I got quite angry with the word as well, because it's you know, there's nothing wrong with being an activist, but then putting it next to the activist lawyer, I think it like kind of reduce the value of what an activist is. So and I don't think that's fair, because activists work mostly voluntary, and they do it out of the passion of love and to protect.
Have we lost the meaning?
Those around them and to make change in their society. And I think I was just saying, I think activists and artists need more respect from our politicians and those in political authority.
Definitely. I've got a couple of more questions, and which is interesting, because this question feeds quite nicely into some of my thoughts about activism and craft and politicians. And I remember once upon a time listening to Saul Williams deliver a speech, and he said that the poet is always ahead of what's happening. The artist, the poet, they write about the reality in which they live, the environment in which they live, and the politicians and the academics play catch up. Yeah. And I understood it so clearly in what he was saying. So this leads quite nicely on to the second question from one of our audience members, which is, what is more important, message or craft? In other words, how do we train to say what we mean while respecting the craft?
Well, I think that's an absolutely brilliant and quite brutal question. And it's one that I think all three of us here have been grappling with our whole lives as artists. Yeah. I think it's really important that you develop a craft, but first of all, you have to ask some really, define your terms. What is this craft we're talking about? We can't talk about poetry without talking about class. We can't talk about it without talking about, you know, all the people who are barred from access to it. My brain's gone blank. Pick me up, Amina. Help me.
Well, I had a bit of a static Wi-Fi. Can you just repeat the last?
Sorry. Amina, what is more important, the message or the craft? Yeah.
Okay.
In other words, how do you train to say what you mean? Yeah. While respecting the craft. So what's more important? Is it the message or the craft of, I guess, writing or being an artist?
They work together. You can't separate the poet from its poetry. You can't separate the writer from its writing. You can't separate the photography from the photographer. They come in a package, and yeah, they come together. They are.
You should keep trying to find the best way of getting your work across according to what audience you've got. What's appropriate for poetry review isn't going to be appropriate for, you know, Dirty Dicks on a Friday night. Do you get me? It's an actual place, by the way.
Yeah. Okay, we've got a couple of more questions before we wrap up. So I'd like to get through them. This is really good though, because it really gets us even thinking as writers, as artists, about ourselves as activists, you know, and that word being active in all what we do. The craft of writing is an activity in itself, and what we're writing about, how we view the world, and what we want to bring to the forefront, I think is so important. So the other question is, what activist poets are you inspired by? What common thread is there between them and yourself? So who inspires you as an activist?
Can I start off with this, because I was doing
The
research on him?
Poet, but I guess we could open it a little bit more in terms of what we have in common with them.
Yeah, I would say a poet that I just discovered recently is Muhammad Zubairi, who's a poet from Yemen from the 60s who started the revolution. They call him the conscious of Yemen. And there's a lot of poets that I read. I've got books all over. But I think there's something about reading poetry from someone who writes radical love letters to the home that you yearn for. So when I read Muhammad Zubairi, I honestly cried. And now I read him nearly every day just to give me that inspiration. So there'll always be that one special poet in your life. And, you know, and he was a poor man, an orphan, but yet he started a revolution. Started a revolution without no tribesmen on himself. And if he can, then we definitely can.
Yeah, wow. I mean, I just went really blank when he said it, and then I realized the reason is because I think most, you know, political poetry as kind of as poetry. So like my first really big thing personally really inspired me as a kid was George Orwell, and it was the book Down and Out in London and Paris, which I read at about 14 years old, and I was like, oh my God, that's what I'm going to do. You know, this idea that somebody throws themselves completely into their research, that they become it. And I found it really inspiring that he came from such a place of privilege, but used it to try to help people. But then now, if you ask me, I don't even know if I don't think they describe themselves as an activist poet, but certainly Dan S. Smith from the States is somebody I return to over and over again, either on YouTube, Button Poetry, or their two books, Don't Call Us Dead and Homie, the last two books. And I know the connection between me as a white lesbian with, you know, a queer, Black, non-binary activist, what is the connection? The passion, the focus, the attention to craft and detail, as well as the attention to the actual meat of the story, the narrative. Yeah, Daniel Smith is banging.
Most definitely. And I just want to respond to you both in different ways. So mentioning Danes, that's really interesting because I met him as a very young poet at Brave New Voices.
Oh.
Yeah. And so, and as you know, Brave New Voices is the US, I guess the US version of Slambassadors in a way.
That's massive.
You know, because we have to give thanks and honor those who have laid the foundation for young people in the UK, and I know that you were one of the first to do that. And you know, I know there were other people doing it, and following in quick pursuit is leading authors around slam. Yeah, you know, let's blow our own trumpets, and that's all through, I believe, activism, being active. to pass on that message. And although we talked about passing the mic, I'm just thinking about where Danez was when I met him over 10, 15 years ago, you know, at Brave New Voices, to where he is now as an amazing poet who's out there just doing some amazing things and really being able to come into his own being, you know, to write about who he is and his identity, which was actually one of the questions I really wanted to talk about within our own discussion here. And then leading on to Amina, when you're talking about, I've forgotten the name, the poet from Yemen, the poet that started this whole, you're talking about revolution and movement and things. And I guess one of the things that I may find in common with yourself, it's just like Joe said, hey, what do I have in common with Danez? You know, and we're kind of juxtaposing our terms of our identity and culture and environment. And I guess I could do the same in terms of yourself being a Yemeni scout, so as you describe yourself, and me, African Caribbean woman born in Britain. But I found myself in the 90s living in Yemen.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Where in Yemen?
I was in Sana'a. Yeah. I was in Sana'a, but I traveled, and it's interesting because people go, where in Yemen? I was in Sana'a. But I traveled to Taiz and a whole different range of places in Yemen, Hajra Mount and places like that. So as a student, learning the language and studying poetry and literature in Yemen, and having to do that through the technicality of this Arab language, you know, which is considered the most purest in Yemen. So, and it was interesting because at that point, in reference books, you couldn't find out who were the poets because nobody was talking about them outside in that European canon, which we often find can be quite restrictive. So it's interesting that you're now talking about this. So I will kind of make a note of that name when you tell me the name again.
Mohammed Zubairi, but I can send it to you.
Yes, please.
But honestly, I don't know if you saw, but I literally, my face lit up when you said you went to Yemen. I think because Yemen is such like, you know, it's one of the oldest Arab nations, you know, it belongs to all the Arab countries that exist now. And when people say, I visit Yemen, I'm like, really? You know, because like nobody knows of it, but everyone's visited, walked past it, traded with it.
Yeah, so it's such a rich culture, and not to go off the beaten track, we're just going back to that thing of women and activism and things like that. And when you're there and they're speaking about Bilqis being this queen, and you go to Ethiopia and they call her Makeda, and then when we kind of put the story together, it's the Queen of Sheba. You know that she is the occupier of this vast land of trade and respect, you know, and just the magic when we think about activism back then, that she traveled these vast lands in trade and all these things, and she's such a respectful figure that if you're into any religious documentation, her name appears everywhere, whether it's in the Bible or the Quran, all of these things. So that's quite amazing. I do want to make sure, I'm speaking quite quickly because there's a couple of more questions that I need to ask. And one of them, I guess, is really for you, Joelle, because it says, with the Zoom revolution, are organizing like Outspoken, with organizations like Outspoken, are they making workshops, events more accessible to people outside of London?
Well, this is the thing. This has been the kind of the best outcome for this pandemic, for this horrible period in people's lives, is that we have all been forced to do these kind of these Zoom things. And obviously I want to get back to live gigs. We all do. I want to get back to live workshops and traveling, all of that. But this has actually accidentally sparked a revolution in access. And for example, I with Outspoken Press, I organised a gig 2 weeks ago, which had something like 5 different countries taking part. Everyone just coming in, dropping a poem, you know, in support of Beirut after the explosion. So I think we must continue this after, when we get back into spaces. We must find new ways of using this kind of technology so people who aren't in the cities can access it, people who aren't able-bodied can access, people who are in different countries but want to come to a gig can actually go. Why don't we turn this into a positive, you know?
Yeah. And that's really interesting in terms of this, the question being the Zoom revolution, that whole movement of accessibility, and because London's very central to so many things when it comes to the spoken word and the poetry world. In the UK, it's very focused around London. Although I'm very much aware of Writing on the Wall being very active in what they're doing in Liverpool, and you've got a Common Word and Young Identity in Manchester. You've got a whole range of people doing amazing things, but it is about that accessibility to, and I think what happens often is that if you don't have the access to what's happening in London, you can actually fall off the shelf a little bit and not.
Completely. Still London-centric, you know, as an artist community, but yeah, this takes away the centricity, doesn't it?
Yeah.
You know?
So is that how we see this movement? Do we feel like even with organisations like Poets in the City, who I know work nationally as well, how do we think that we can use this revolution movement through this pandemic to reset? I'm going to say that I don't use the word lockdown because I've not committed a crime. I am not.
I've only ever heard it used in prison before. You know, it is like, I thought this yesterday. I was in Wormwood Scrubs and I was like, lockdown. Like, we are so not in lockdown. That is really not like it is.
You know, and I'm trying to encourage people to think about, because we're wordsmiths, aren't we? That's what we are. We use words to formulate and craft on the page and on the stage, and so we should analyze words in society the way.
I think this new technology we should use, like, say when we start, I don't know what the guys think about this, but if we start the big productions at the South Bank Centre again for Outspoken, it would be really good to be able to have people who could access it via live stream in some way, for example, you know, and broaden an audience, and people who aren't feeling too confident about getting, you know, into a theatre at this time. But also ways we can use it for workshops, not just like we're doing now, but how about, you know, there's a room of people and there's also a Zoom of people, and those ways of interacting. We can think of different ways we could run it.
Yeah, and also the accessibility of diverse languages in those spaces, and that they're not secondary, because we always think that you know, the English language being central. How do we then, as poets in this time of this pandemic, reset our thinking to, you know, I'm part of that sound system culture, so rewind and come again, my select. And that's what we, you know, we are the selectors of the sound system, of the music, we're like a mixtape, you know, we can rewind and come again, we can scratch it, we can do all things and reset our thinking to really shift this movement in a way that can benefit the world globally, have that global impact of those many voices that are coming out. I can imagine that the accessibility to the internet is probably so great in Yemen at this moment in time. How do you find those people, the people that are based in Britain, that can tell those stories like yourself? You know what I mean? How do we get those stories of gender and equality and all of those issues to the forefront, where we're really having this whole mixtape discussion about equality and activism? So those are kind of things. That's my last question to you both before we wrap up. What are your thoughts on the Zoom revolution? What are your thoughts on resetting time and coming back again? And what does the future look like for you both?
Yeah, should I go? I would say, well, just to add on to lockdown, I don't call it a lockdown. I just call it, you know, the world is just taking a moment. And you know, we're all in this together, so it's just a moment. And yes, we're grieving. Some of us are grieving, some of us are struggling, some of us are reflecting, and some of us are achieving, some of us are, you know, maybe taking a step back, maybe taking a step forward, and that's okay. And how I see the Zoom, I honestly, Zoom has worked really well. I mean, in terms of freelancing, I understood how much artists need rights and freelancers, because firstly, the we can do so much more now in our day, because the traveling just took so much time, and then try and fitting in everyone in. And then I think the second thing, it's more of accessibility. You know, I'm an advocate for you know, making art accessible. So now people are adding subtitles, like, wow, subtitles exist. And you know, I'm the first, I have to practice that myself. I get it, it does cost a little bit more, but if we make it normal and we make it the norm, then we could get more funding to produce work that is accessible for everyone. The second thing, you know, I did an event with Arab women from Beirut, from Jordan, from, you know, the UK, from Yemen, and we had female writers in one Zoom call. We would have never had that opportunity.
Yeah,
And that was a lot.
agree.
Yeah. So
That's,
definitely. I was just going to say, and in terms of the last, sorry, Joelle, we'll leave you last to the best. And the last, where do I see myself in the future? You know what, where I see myself tomorrow is a healthier and brighter young woman, and hopefully I can take that, whatever I've learned from yesterday, I can take to my future. I plan big, but I also don't let these things live my life. So I would like to publish, perform all over the world, all of this, but I think most of all is always go back to where I began, and that was pen on paper and honesty.
100%. Yeah. Everything Amina said, I mean, about increasing access, 100%. And the potential for international collaboration, the potential for using it as Zoom as a part of a kind of live event as well. And I think, yeah, making it the new normal, asking the questions is where we begin, you know, Khadijah. Just asking those questions means people go, oh, so we could have subtitles in different languages according to, you know, who is watching. You could have subtitles as a base thing, or BSL as a base thing. Yeah, I think the future, weirdly, is really bright if we embrace what we've learned. We can, in fact, as artists now, we have much more freedom, like you were saying. You know, I could actually be talking to you from Koh Phangan instead of East London. So maybe I should just go and live there and like just dial in occasionally, put on my old tweets. I think for me, the future is focus, keep writing, keep trying to affect change. My next book, Conto, is about writing into this moment in the LGBTQ community and the history. That's it, really. The future is just about carrying on.
So, and where can we find you? What platforms? What are your social media platforms where we can find yourself and Amina? So, can you just let our listeners?
Twitter, I'm at J Taylor Trash, and it's the same on Instagram, J Taylor Trash, and Facebook, Joelle Taylor. I kind of hardly use it at the moment.
Right,
and mine's just my name. Sorry,
Amina, I didn't mean to cut you there. So I just want to. You're on Twitter, you're on Facebook, you're on Instagram.
Yeah.
Joelle
Taylor.
Trash.
Yeah, J Taylor Trash.
I
Taylor, yeah.
All right, I just want to make sure that our viewers get that, yeah. And then yourself, Amina.
Yeah, I think our viewers can see our name on the Zoom thing, so it's just the same. Amina Atik, and then just poetry, and that's the same for Instagram and Twitter. And I do follow back.
And you do. Brilliant.
Of course we do. I wanna let's create a bigger poetry community of activists. Let's connect. Let's collaborate. Because when we do collaborate, we make some amazing work.
Yeah.
That is so true. And I want to thank you both. I want to thank Joelle Taylor and Amina Atik for participating in this Poet in the City event. I want to thank all the viewers. And if you'd like to subscribe to Poet in the City channel on YouTube, look for them as Poets in the City. If you'd like to work with Poets in the City and you like the work that they're doing and you want to support them as a non-profit organisation, and you want to consider becoming a poetry patron for as little as £1 a month. Hey, come on now, do support them. And you'll find the links in the description box on YouTube. So I'd like to thank both our poets. We've got your social media handles, which is amazing. I want to keep an eye out for further What Is events by Poets in the City. My name is Khadijah Ibrahiim, and I have been your host. And you can find me on Instagram and Facebook, not on Twitter. I keep on being told off, but if you look for me on Twitter, you're going to find me under LYA Poets. So you can contact me that way on Twitter. Otherwise, it's Khadijah Ibrahiim, and that's Ibrahiim with 2 eyes, honey. Because otherwise, you're going to get the other Khadijah Ibrahiim from a whole different country. I think Thailand. Who's looking for love. I mean, I'm always looking for love. You know, but that's Khadijah Ibrahiim. That's Ibrahim. Yeah, because let's do things just a little bit different. So I've been your host, and I've been in this space with Joelle Taylor. Big her up. Click, 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 click. Amina Atik. Click, click, click.
Oh, thank you.
And lots of thanks to.
And Khadijah, can we give you a round of applause as well, Khadijah?
I will accept your applause. Thank you very much. This has been an amazing time. I've really enjoyed speaking to both of you. I love your poetry. I'm going to be looking out for your new collection, Joelle. I'm going to be looking out for your future collection, Amina. Yeah, I hope you're working on it, and let's just stay connected. So once again, thank you to Poets in the City for hosting this event, and do look out for other events that they'll be hosting in the future. I'd like to say good afternoon, take care, and once upon a time we'd say safe journey because she was in a space, but you know what? Safety in your home, safety in your environment, take care, look after yourselves, and salutations. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.